Hi there, I'm Beth Cougler Blom, and this is Facilitating on Purpose, the space where we talk about designing and facilitating learning. In this episode, I chat with my friend and colleague Marisa Gelfusa. Marisa is not only a friend, she was one of the people I interviewed when I wrote my book, Designed to Engage. I interviewed people all over Canada, and I interviewed Marisa because I knew her from when she worked at Volunteer Toronto and I worked at Volunteer Victoria. We had met many years earlier in Montreal for a wonderful meeting of people who coordinated training programs at volunteer centers, which is what we did earlier in our careers. And ever since that point, Marisa and I had kept in touch, and I interviewed her to get her thoughts and contributions to Design to Engage. So she is featured in that book. Well, I was catching up with Marisa recently, and she told me that in the master's degree in educational studies that she's pursuing, she's looking at using poetry. And we got talking about that, and then it just evolved into this, hey, why don't we do an episode about using poetry and expressive writing in our facilitation practice, both for ourselves to be a reflexive practice for us as facilitators, but also that we can use it in the room with our students or our participants, whoever we're working with. The interesting thing is that poetry sometimes gets a bad rap, doesn't it? Because it's not always understandable to all of us, and sometimes it feels inaccessible. But I think if you listen to this episode with Marisa and hear how she's using poetry in the classroom and how she's using expressive writing techniques outside of academia, I should stress that it becomes just a little easier for us to think about how to do this in our own work, in our workshops, in our sessions, and maybe how it could support our own practice as facilitators as well. So here is Marisa Gelfusa, my friend and colleague, and I hope you enjoy the show. To prepare for this, I listened a little bit to the interview that I did with you when I interviewed you for my book.
Oh my gosh, that was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago. It was
Yeah.
in
Oh my gosh.
2019. And one of the neat things was, I didn't listen to it all. I think I listened to about 15 or 20 minutes. But one of the neat things you said was that as a facilitator, you become a bridge. And I thought that's so neat. And it's so apropos for our conversation today, because you're now this bridge to all of us, I think, for this particular topic, which is really new to me. I don't think a lot about poetry. I don't use a lot of poetry in my work. And I think a lot of people would be saying the same things. Let's talk about what that bridge is that you want to make for folks today. Like, why poetry, and how did you become excited about it?
Yeah. So no one is more surprised than me that I'm writing poetry. I think that because of my own background, there wasn't a lot of poetry at the house. And even just learning about it. And I thought about this, and there's a poem by Billy Collins that's amazing called Introduction to Poetry. And I wonder if I could read you a couple of lines about it.
Sure.
So he starts and he says, I asked them, so he's teaching. So it's called Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he said, but all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. I mean, my understanding of what Billy Collins is saying here is that poetry is something to marvel at, to sort of take a walk in. You know, it's not a triathlon. You don't have to get a gold medal. Poetry really works when you can take it inside yourself. I think most poets would be very happy to learn that, you know, you took a walk around their poem, it meant something to you, or one of the images worked for you, or that kind of thing. And so I think there's a lot of baggage around poetry that's really unfortunate, because poetry is such an amazing way to distill authentic voice. And it doesn't mean that, you know, the best poetry is the stuff that you wrote in 10 minutes. You know, like certainly in my opinion, right? So we're talking about poetry from my perspective, because my relationship to poetry is in how it helps me connect with myself, how it helps me connect with others, and how I can use it to facilitate for people to understand things about each other and to understand things about themselves. That's the role of a facilitator. And to me, poetry is the great facilitator.
Wow, that's such a neat thing. So, when you use it, are you writing poetry as well, or are you using it as a device for those ways that you mentioned, or both?
So, all those things. I use poetry in a lot of ways. So, I use poetry as a reflexive tool. So, to figure out what's going on. I agree that it's a muscle, right? And that and I agree, and every single facilitation I've ever done around writing and poetry, the critic my critic comes out, sits on my shoulder. That's a terrible prompt. What do you, that nobody's going to relate to that, whatever. And then I can see, right, when you give a prompt to people, and then I can see there's a thing that comes over people's faces, the freeze, the I don't know how to do this. What am I going to say? Or it's stupid or what have you. But the thing is that if we keep going, if I just say to you, we're going to write, right now, we're going to write, I sometimes use pictures and say, we're going to write. I have a really funny picture of a lady who's squished in a phone booth with 3 or 4 of her kids, and she's on the phone, right? And I say, well, we're going to write for 7 minutes on this picture. Anything like, who is this lady? What's happening? Do you know her? Did you know her? That kind of thing. And they just start writing. Two things, like the time crunch, you have 7 minutes, that helps. And we also make jokes about the critic. We say, okay, tell your critics to go to Starbucks and get you a coffee, or something more local, actually, and get you a coffee, so that you can get on with writing. And, the critic never goes away, but it's a myth, right? To think one day I'm going to sit down, my heart's going to open up. I'm going to write this perfect thing. The thing is that you're always just writing as yourself, right? Actually, I have a favorite, really great quote by an American poet that says, a poem's power inheres less in its conclusions than its propensity to resist them. That means that it's so suited to human expression because we are so many things at the same time, right? And poems with their strategies like spaces and words and sounds and the word choices and that kind of thing, they're concise and their distilled nature. And so many things live in one poem. But then, furthermore, in my workshops, in the writing workshops that I do, I run a creative writing workshop at a cancer center for people who have received a cancer diagnosis. One of the things that we do is we read out loud. Okay, you just wrote this thing, it's a draft, you just like whatever, you're not a writer. And now you have to read it in front of 10, 12 people out loud. That's incredible. Like, first of all, you cultivate this deep listening, because you're listening to the person without judgment. I always say, like, we're not here, this is not Penguin, publishing. No one has submitted a thing, but this deep listening happens. And anything that you write, sometimes people write about funny things, all of us laugh, but we receive it with generosity. And what happens is that any, baggage around what you were going to say is gone because now it's free and you said it, right? And the workshops, the objective of the workshops is to set aside some time to connect with your authentic voice. That's who we want to hear from in the workshop,
Yeah. So
right?
it's not necessarily a writing workshop. You're not saying these are the 8 skills of writing and please use them and blah, blah, blah.
No.
Not anything like that. Or it's really a method or mode of self-expression, a way to get them to be honest with themselves and share that with others.
Yes, but also share this beauty and these beautiful things that we all have and that we all can say, and this unique experience that we have that, we have a unique experience, but it's like poetry helps us. And Sandra Faulkner said this. She's a researcher and a poet. She says that what poetry does is it take unique experiences and we're all able to relate to them universally. So in terms of, sorry, just to get back to facilitation. So in terms of facilitation, I use poetry, one, as a reflexive tool. I use it for myself. And one of the things that I did that might be of interest to other facilitators is that I started by writing my teaching philosophy statement. I had been doing a lot of gigs. I love my gigs, but sometimes, and I was listening to a couple of your podcasts and kind of, understood like sometimes you have to do gigs that, are more or less related to your sense of values or stuff like that. And sometimes that can take you away from what you came here to do in the first place. This is hard work. It's hard to be a facilitator. It's hard to be in front of everybody and keep, hold space for everybody and keep eyes on everybody and who's bored and who's this working for and, are we getting to the objectives? Am I going to make my time? Those are all the things that we do. So at the very least, if we are able to be fulfilling, if we feel like we're walking in tandem with our value or the thing that we came to do in collaboration with the participants, then that's really is a surefire way to beat compassion fatigue or whatever facilitators get,
You mentioned your teaching philosophy statement. So did that lead you to poetry or did you write it in a poetic style or
No, I
no?
wrote it. I followed some kind of University of Iowa guideline because I think you have to submit one when you apply for teaching positions. I wasn't applying, but I wanted to write a teaching philosophy statement. So yeah, I wrote it. And then I pulled out, this is an exercise anybody can do, is you take a highlighter and you highlight all the important parts of what you just wrote. And then you can pull it out and make a poem with that, or by moving words around, cutting words, that kind of thing. But what I did was I wrote a whole other poem because I realized that the reason I was a facilitator, that had to do so much with the gratitude I had for, my journey and my parents, even though they had very little education, and how bright they were and how that's not always recognized. So I wrote a poem about that. And that was very clarifying to me about, like I could always go into session with my value right in front of mind. What am I doing here? What did I come here to do?
I'm thinking about the word reflexive because I
Yes.
literally had to look it up again to go, yeah, what is the difference between reflective and reflexive? Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, how is writing or how is poetry reflexive for you? What is it giving you?
Right. So reflexive is when you're reflecting, but you're feeding it back to yourself to make yourself better. So it's a practice where you're looking at what you're doing, you're thinking about it, and you're applying whatever you think are ways that you might do that better. And so that's what poetry does, right? Because you have poetry, you write it down, you play with it. And also a lot of it is, and this only came to me like after a while of doing it, but after a certain time, it just emerges, it comes up. But it's just a matter of allowing it and practicing that.
Yeah, you have it come more naturally to you or
That's
something.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or it takes less time to, get the critic out of the way and for you to sit down. And what happens is that you can access that part of yourself much more easily if it's not the first time you open the door and it's jammed and rusted.
You said before that no one was more surprised than you that you came to poetry. What can you say a little bit more about that? Why were you resistant at first? Did it kind of hit you in the head and you didn't realize it was coming?
Well, mostly I mostly I have to say that I couldn't relate to poetry, right? I couldn't relate to it. I liked short stories. I wrote a lot of short stories and that kind of thing. But I also had this idea about what it had to be until, unfortunately, my cousin was passing and she was at palliative care. And there were only a couple of us that were available to care for her. So it was a big, big emotional load. And there wasn't too many people to discuss that with. So I had to find a way to process. And I couldn't sit there and write a short story. So I had a little notebook while I was sitting with my cousin as she was passing and just wrote a couple of poems every day, like as we were there, like we split 12-hour shifts. And that's just how it went.
Yeah. It served you at the time, it sounds like. Yeah.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
did.
you needed it.
Yes, that's right. And all I didn't do anything crazy. I just wrote what I was thinking, and because I was just like sitting there a long time, I just wrote what I was thinking.
And you knew you didn't have to share it with anybody. Maybe at
That's
that
right.
moment too. Hey, it was just for you.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it makes me think about the participants though. I mean, so you knew you could keep it private in those moments as you were learning and practicing and growing in it. But you said with the cancer center folks,
Mhm.
they will share. What do you do? I mean, you're making a comfortable environment for them to share, but do you have resistors, so to speak? Do you say it's okay if you don't, or how do
Yes.
you kind of navigate that sharing or not?
Well, you know what? I always say it's all right if you don't want to share, but nobody never passes. No one has ever passed because, so what will sometimes happen is that the people who are either more comfortable with the situation, they will read. And what happens is that everyone else witnesses, obviously this is something you have to facilitate. Like we said, there's no talking while the person is reading. I am inviting you to do some really deep listening. Be present. Don't be writing while the person is reading their work. They're being very brave and they're doing something very scary. So we have to honor that. And of course, everybody's heart is pounding, so they know what I'm talking about. And everyone reads. And then when it's received, like so warmly, it just does work well. And I want to say, like, this is not my idea. It's a method by Pat Schneider, and it's the AWA method. And Pat Schneider works, well, she worked she started this whole amazing movement, but she worked in prisons and with different in community organizations, that kind of thing. She's the one who brings the voice, and the importance of reading. You know how people say, like, everybody has a book in them, like one day, like everyone's saying, like, one day I'm gonna write a book, you know and it's because we have it, and we want to say it, and we want to tell it to each other, right? Because that feels really good,
Yeah.
and it's really important. And you're going to think, okay, so touchy feely, okay, but not always. I recently, last year, did this exercise at a big, big conference that was full of oncologists and doctors and chemistry specialists, and there was like about 100 people in the room. Well, I was presenting on just some of the work that I did at the cancer center. And I have to tell you that the person who presented before me was this highly sought after doctor who had found this like fantastic way of controlling pain. And when her time was up and there were still 20 million questions for her. And then I was going to go up with my thing on poetry.
Yeah. Yeah. Juxtaposition.
Yeah, yeah. And I thought, oh my gosh, but they were kind enough and they heard me out. Then I led them through a poetry exercise, all 100 of them, presented a poem as a prompt, on kindness, and then asked them to write a short poem on the kindnesses they had experienced or witnessed in their wards. So many people participated. There were cards on the table. I thought, going to have like 3 people. So many people participated. And actually, then I took the cards back and with the help of another doctor, sort of pulled out some of them and we wrote a 2-page poem that's actually quite reflective. And the point of that was that at that conference, I asked, does anybody want to read? Anybody want to read in front of these 100 other doctors?
Yeah.
We had lots of people who wanted to read.
Nice.
Yeah, yeah. And not a dry eye in the place either.
Wow, that's so transformational I work a
Yeah.
lot in healthcare, with clients in healthcare. And so sometimes we can really get stereotypical
Oh,
about that type
yes.
of environment or the
100%.
didactic nature of, those kind of
Yeah.
conferences or whatever.
Yeah.
But, anyone that's kind of listening that's in environments where arts-based stuff doesn't happen, I think it tells us that we can. It's not just at cancer centers with patients. It's, where you might think it's a little bit more touchy-feely or something, right? It's for everyone.
Right. There's a woman in Toronto. Her name is Rona Bloom. I read an article where she did this thing, and actually healthcare, where people have tons of different perspectives, right? Doctors have one objective, nurses have another objective, peripheral therapies have other objectives, that kind of thing. She runs workshops where they write everybody together, a mixed table, where they write from their perspective about like what they are trying to do with the patient, and what they need from the rest of the team. And then they read it to each other. It's hard to have that conversation, right? You can't just sort of tap somebody on the shoulder and say, hey, Mr. Supervisor, or Mr. Whatever. This is what I'm trying to do. This is what's important to me, and this is what I really need from you to help me do this.
And this is like the enabling factor or enabling method or something to get them there, right? Because
Yes.
actually, I think there's a liberating structure that's similar. I've never run it, so I can't tell you much about it. I'd have to look it up myself, but it's called What I Need From You. All we need is a facilitator to come in and set a good scene for the group and try to build that trusting environment, don't we? And then we make an invitation to an activity. You're making an invitation to write poetry, but as soon as a good facilitator comes in the room and does what we do, we can get people there, can't we? Even when they're not used to doing that at all. And so when we make the invitation, most times people do come along and they benefit from it.
Yes. Yes. I would say it's been my experience. And then I always have the caveat of you may not be interested in the prompt, or you can just write about whatever's on your mind right now. Or if there's something you've been thinking about writing about that's unrelated to the prompt, just write it. There's a lot of freedom. There's a lot of agency. That's what really matters. Yeah.
What can it do for the person? Because I had an episode recently about dealing with burnout in my own self and trying to figure out what to do about that. I know a lot of us are in that situation, and healthcare for sure. We're always talking about burnout and trying to mitigate or avoid that. So if you can bring people along on this journey to learn how to use poetry to help themselves, what can it do for them? What can it do for us?
First of all, just carving out that time. What I feel is that a lot of surprises come up when you start writing a poem. Like it's very, very, it's not at all unusual that you finish something that you had no idea that you were going to write. That's about getting things on the page. One of the things that I do is I have a practice. So during COVID, one of the things I realized that was that with work, caregiving, and all these demands on me, that I was losing this playful part of myself, this part that likes to come out and play and just do whatever, where there's lots of freedom and that kind of thing. And so I asked a couple of my friends if they would meet with me twice a week for an hour, rotating prompts. Everybody's like with facilitator teachers. So that's, so rotating prompts. And we're still writing together, actually. It's our 5th year together. And so that really helped. And so sometimes the way that that really helped was that, I mean, I learned a lot about what was going on in their lives without them telling me, like, oh, if somebody's writing about, their kids or that kind of thing, that was really helpful. But the other way that we as facilitators can support people is, when we facilitate, we invite people to come to specific concepts or tables or ideas, right? And so I think that this is a real force for good, like we're like one of the Avengers, if you will, because, if you invite people to come to their own strengths, their own resilience, their own abilities, their own skills, because that's all there, but it might not be the first thing they think of, right? I recently did a facilitation last Friday with some very, and I'm sorry, this is another healthcare example. I hope that's okay. I've just been doing mostly in healthcare with some nurses who work on very critical cases. They're pivot nurses. So what I was working with the art therapist, and she brought some clay and they worked with some clay for a few minutes, and she invited them to use the clay to think about, this strength, like what they bring to the work that makes them so strong, that makes them keep going. And then my part, which is the writing, and which was, when you write it down, you kind of bring it more to the surface. And then the writing part was I asked the nurses to write a letter to themselves from that part, so that the letter starts like, dear, your name. And to say, like, what does that part know about you? What does it know that you can do? What does it know about where this strength came from? There was a lot of amazing, amazing writing. And I think that, and they said, like, did mention how, how helpful it was to hear from other people too, and to write it. Yeah.
And share that together.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the prompts make such a difference because I must admit, as soon as you said write a letter to themselves, a lot of us have done that over the years, right?
Mhm.
But the difference is in the prompts, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if you can create a really meaty, juicy, I don't know what words you would say. What words would you say around how to craft that gets them where you hope they would go?
Yeah, I would say like the prompt has to be inviting enough, and it has to be open enough that people can jump on from anywhere they are. I use other poems as prompts a lot, other poems. Like there's one poem that I use called Some Days, again about resilience, right? It's a poem about like how some days you have to, well, one of the beautiful lines in that poem, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the author. It says like some days you have to open the window and let what is inside out and what is outside in. It's a lovely poem. And when you ask people to do that with that poem prompt, it's like, what do you do some days? And so they'll say, like, some days you just have to walk by the lake. Some days you just have to, draw the blinds. Some days you just have to, that kind of thing. And it's about bringing out the strength and the all that stuff that's in there. Yeah, that's really important. That sometimes gets relegated to, number 700,
And we don't share it because we're so used to the small talk and, especially when people get in together and meet each other for the first time in workshops. I mean, how much do you really divulge of what's going on in your real life? All the things. You're not going to divulge it all, but at least it's an entry into sharing something.
Yes.
Isn't it?
And what's really important is if you're going to facilitate using writing is do not start with, the hardest thing I ever had to confront in my life, not that. I always have like a 2-minute write where I say like, write where you're coming from, or write what you had for breakfast, or write about, the weirdest teacher you ever had. And then we do a round of reading there. So it's not scary, right? We start by reading, this morning I had oatmeal, I wanted oat milk, but there was none left, yada, 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 whatever. So we start there and then we just work our way to, other prompts, which are not always like heavy. Sometimes they're really funny and yeah.
Yeah, I love that. What do you say about process versus product? Because you might think on the face of it, a participant might go, oh, I don't want to create a poem, or I don't know how to create a poem. But really, it almost feels like you're not saying that. It's like the main point is not to create a poem, right? It's to get them to do all that inner reflexive thinking and work, right? Like, that's the most important part for you, is it?
Well, it's to make space for that voice. If I feel like we've been able to do that together, so it's to make space for that voice and to feel like it can be put out in the world. It's those are my two objectives, right? I have to tell you that a lot of the work, and I mean, I'm not an editor. I like for Random House, like I don't edit, whatever. I have to tell you that depending where you're coming from, the work that gets produced in these environments is like if we were able to get in there, is very authentic and valuable and very beautiful. Like, does it have, 14 lines? Is it the perfect sestina? Is it that blah, blah, blah? I'm not that concerned about it because, people who want to do that are doing that. That's fine. There's courses for that. But that's not why we're using writing or poetry here. The way that we're using writing and poetry is to get people to really hear themselves and to hear others and to share it with others. And that works like, it works like in a, cancer patient environment, but it works in a work environment too. Like it doesn't, again, like as facilitators, we understand like, we can see the invisible lines about where we can invite people to go, in particular environments to keep it safe and to keep it from getting awkward or what have you.
You mentioned editing. I'm actually taking editing courses right now. I'm in the middle of an editing certificate. And one of the neatest things, I think it might have been in the plain language course I just took a few weeks ago. I ended it. I think the instructor said something like, we have to identify our audience for writing, right? And a big mistake that professors or facilitators or whoever, whatever we call ourselves could make when giving the invitation to the student or to the participant is we don't tell them who to write for. So they just write for the professor or the instructor, right? They're just writing, like they're thinking, oh, this is the audience for this thing that I'm writing. But actually, we're always thinking in other contexts, there's a patient out there that's going to read it, or there's a whoever out there that's going to read it. There's a different audience that's going to read the thing. So professors have to be more clear when they're giving instructions about who to write for. But actually, you're talking about people writing to themselves. It feels like most of all, in a way.
Yes, absolutely.
Or for themselves. Maybe I should say it that way.
Yeah, to, for, about, all those things but there's a purpose there. It's because when you pull away, no, a good poem rhymes. No, a good poem uses these types of words. No, a good poem, whatever. When you pull that away, And I mean, these things, it's craft and it's important, right? However, it's craft and it's important, but it's nothing if the poem doesn't have a heart,
Yeah.
you know?
And again, back to purpose. Why are you doing it? Are you doing it to get published in the most famous poetry or literary magazine there is? Or are you doing it to work through something or to share your experience? Yeah.
In this case, it's not a skills-based activity. But I do want to talk about a little bit about poetic inquiry, and that's like using poetry in research.
Yeah. And I wanted to talk about your master's a little bit. Will you share?
Sure, sure. So I'm going to be doing some research. I'm doing a master's in educational studies, and my thesis topic is adults returning to education. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do it on there is I am an adult who has returned to education again and again and again. And I think you and I were talking about like how life fixes it. So, so it takes a while to do that. But I also wanted to write it because when you read about adults returning to education, you read a lot about adults returning to education for financial purposes, to get a better job or to get another job or to keep the job they have, that kind of thing. And I think that anyone who's returned to education knows that when you go back to school, your whole life takes another color. There's a whole other vibe. Everything is affected, everything, in your home, yourself, your environment, that kind of thing. And what I know about poetic inquiry is that it offers. So I didn't want to do like statistics or just say like what kept you from going back to school, what kept you, what pushed you to go back to school, that kind of thing. I wanted to have a conversation with people, and I wanted to offer up this thing about where, all these conflicting truths exist at the same time. And I can do that using poetic inquiry. So, poetic inquiry is when you use poetry to handle research data. So, you can use it to generate data, analyze data, disseminate data, all kinds of things. So, what they do say, I just want to just really swing back to where you were talking about skill in writing. One of the things that they do say, like people say this, like people who do poetic inquiry say that it's really helpful if you have some schooling, if you know how to do poetry, if you're able to then write a good poem to deliver your research. I think that they have a point too, but I've also seen like people who are by no means poets, do community work with poetry and writing and arts-based approaches, all kinds of people, peers and stuff like that. In my opinion, like if the poem works, if you're able to communicate it, then that's the main thing. Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to it. The research is I'll be interviewing some people who returned to school in different like post-secondary, vocational, and even just literacy contexts. Then do some interviews, and then from the interviews, I'm going to pull and make a poem.
Is it going to be incredibly long? I mean, it's a thesis.
The
So
whole,
I'm like,
the whole poem
tell me
will
more.
not be a thesis because I'm pretty sure that's not going to fly.
Okay, so it's interspersed by regular
That's
paragraphs of
right.
text that you would normally do.
Correct.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, yes. So what's going to be is I will take the data in my particular thesis is I'll take the data and create a poem with the data. And then what I'm going to do is so one of two things, right? And it depends on the participants, right? Again, because I think I'm going to lose a couple of people when I say like, oh, this involves poetry.
You got to get ahead of it somehow. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, definitely. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna invite people so I can either pull what I consider to be the important sentences and make poems with the verbatim sentences, or I'm going to invite the participants to co-create with me if they would like. We can look at their interview, like they can highlight, and then we can build the poem together, which I would love to do, but which my supervisor says is going to take forever.
Yeah, I guess it depends how fast you can co-create together, but that sounds more meaningful. You can go to a deeper depth, I suppose, together, right? And get it right a little bit more, because they could look at a word and go, "No, that's not the right word. I don't want to say that."
100%. There's always member check, right? It's like back and forth. Like, is this poem saying what you were saying? Like, what is right about it? Where is it like wrong? That kind of thing. So, because it really has to be representative of the data, and because this is a qualitative study, the data expert is the speaker, is the participant.
Yeah. I'm thinking about all the diverse range of people that you might interview and what it looks like to do that, where they might speak English as an additional language. They might be from completely different cultures from each other, on and on and on, right? And so what does that look like? That's really interesting. Yeah. And to almost meta analyze how they engaged with the process or something as well.
Yes, yes, definitely, definitely. I knew this was the method for me when I was reading some research on women who had lived with methamphetamine addiction. I remember that the two researchers, oh gosh, and now I can't remember their names, I apologize. They did that, like based on the interview. And I think with the help of the participant, they made a very short poem. And I read that poem and I could relate to it so much. I related to it. I've never been in that situation. We had very different lives. And yet, just by using her words and by shaping it into, something that was accessible to me and something also that was beautiful, even though parts of it were quite sad. I couldn't believe how, like, I thought, like, I understand, or I feel like I have a better understanding of this woman's life now and why, what she must have been thinking. And I thought, wow, that's amazing, because there was so far away. Yeah.
And how often does beautiful or the word beauty come up in our environments, right? Whether they're post-secondary or healthcare or corporate or nonprofit or whatever, we don't really think a lot about connecting with each other around emotional beauty, or however we might say it, right? That's a really lovely thing that people can do with and for each other too.
Yeah, yeah. And it was beautiful because it was so honest. Like, this lady wasn't trying to do anything. She was just honest, and sad, but very beautiful in its honesty.
Marisa, if someone's listening to this and they're thinking, okay, you've convinced me, I think I'm going to try this a little bit. Is there anything else you want to say to those people out there who haven't included poetry or expressive writing in their work yet, or in their facilitation practice? What do you want to say to them?
Well, I would say start slow, because especially if you're not 100% with it, just start slow. But something very simple like a prompt. I mean, we use prompts all the time, like three things that you will be doing when you leave this workshop that you can apply immediately, like that's a prompt. So just start slow. And I would really encourage facilitators, because teachers have to write a teaching philosophy statement, but facilitators, nobody asks us for a teaching philosophy statement, and we have one, whether we know it or not. We have beliefs about what it should look like when we facilitate, what the results should be, that kind of thing. I would really encourage facilitators to, happy to give you the link to I found that Iowa University helpful, that's got prompt questions about what you should put in, to write it and then to pull out the heart, you know, the highlight with a yellow highlighter, highlight the lines that are meaningful to you, pull them out, put them on another page, and see what happens.
That's so neat. I hope people do that. And I might dig out the old teaching philosophy statement that I wrote many, many years ago when I was doing my master's. I think I had to do it then too, and just see what happens. It's an easy place to start, right? And starts with ourselves and what we're trying to do here. Yeah, in our work.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely to reconnect. I mean, we've been connected for years and years. And if people don't know, Marisa was one of the people I interviewed to inform my book. And I had the pleasure of having that conversation with her 6 years ago now. And I just so appreciate hearing what you're up to now and having you teach me something that I don't really dig into very much. And it's been so wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. And thanks for your great work. I was just listening to your Outcomes podcast again. I was like thinking, because I'd heard it before, and then I was just listening to it again and thinking, oh my gosh. I mean, just the way you put it in very clear terms about, what matters and why it matters and the order and, these couple of options. I just thought, where were you 20 years ago when I had to figure it out by myself? Yeah.
Yeah, I was the same. I mean, we're talking about masters in education, right? Educational studies. I actually was in the educational studies department as well when I did my master's in adult education. And no one ever taught me how to write a learning outcome, right? So that's a whole other conversation, isn't it? But we persevere in some of the stuff and a lot of it on our own and with the help of colleagues always. So thanks again. Lovely conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Beth.
It was such a pleasure to check in again with Marisa and see how she's doing and learn from her around these things to do with poetry and expressive writing. It's been wonderful to dip my toe into this area that I don't normally dip into very often. I have been touched by poetry here and there in my career, and one of the biggest examples I had was when I took the instructional skills workshop training, and this master facilitator, some of you will know him, Doug Kerr, he facilitated the 4-day workshop so that we could learn how to teach the instructional skills workshop. And Doug used poetry, I think, every day of the 4-day workshop that he facilitated. And I remember just being touched by it. It made the workshop more special. It made it more memorable for me to be a part of it. And I asked him where the poetry came from that he used in the session. And he told me it was this little book called Teaching with Fire, Poetry That Sustains the Courage to Teach by Sam Intrater and Megan Scribner. I'll put that in the show notes for you. But I thought it might be fun to just read one poem that's in Teaching with Fire for you. Maybe this was one of the poems that Doug read for us. I'm not sure, but it's one that has spoken to me, and maybe it will leave you thinking about what you might do next after this, thinking about poetry or your facilitation practice in general. Here it is. It's called The Journey by Mary Oliver. One day, you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. "Mend my life," each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. I hope you enjoyed that little bit of poetry to end our episode thinking about poetry. Thanks again to Marisa Gelfusa for being with me and teaching me so much today. On the next episode of the podcast, I have a conversation with Guillaume Vermette. Guillaume is a humanitarian clown and a therapeutic clown, and our conversation dives into what he does in those roles that is intentional, that is full of the skills that we use in facilitation. I know we're not clowns, but we can learn a lot from therapeutic clowns. Catch me next time with Guillaume Vermette on the show. I'll see you then. Thank you for listening to Facilitating on Purpose. If you were inspired by something in this episode, please share it with a friend or a colleague to help them expand their facilitation practice too. To find the show notes, give me feedback, or submit ideas for future episodes, visit facilitatingonpurpose.com. Special thanks to Mary Chan at Organized Sound Productions for producing this episode. Happy facilitating!